Sorry, hello everybody, this is Antonio Wolf. Excuse me for the coughing occasionally. Got a long, late spring cold, but it shouldn't be too much of an issue. Going to partially watch this interview of Graham Priest on Theories of Everything podcast. I've already seen it. I thought there's certain things that he says which are not up to par for somebody so famous and well-respected as he is, in my opinion. Not that I'm speaking from his perspective, because I'm not. Main reason I want to comment on it is a lot of people, for some reason, claim that this guy's a Hegelian. He's not. Now, I don't think he claims he's a Hegelian either. He just kind of, as far as Dialetheism goes, Hegel and Buddhism, particularly Madhyamaka, is the main things he kind of historically points out as being things that he's close to with Dialetheism. But beyond that, there's nothing Hegelian about this guy. Nonetheless, I shall critique him from a Hegelian lens. So we shall see where that goes.
Sometimes this kind of notion
the
of
intro,
truth is said.
you can find out all on your own.
So, Professor, there are various Zeno's paradoxes. Many people just know about the one, about the tortoise, and you just go half and half. You can't overtake the tortoise. But there's another one that you like called Zeno's arrow. Can you please outline that for the audience?
So, as you say, 4 paradoxes from Zeno have come down to us. The ones that most people are aware of are the ones that depend on the thought that you can't do an infinite number of things in a finite time. So if I'm going from here to Toronto, I've got to get halfway first and then halfway again and halfway again and so on. So before I get to Toronto, I've done an infinite number of things. And the paradox depends on the thought you can't do that in a finite time. And no one would now think that's true, although it might have been a plausible assumption for Zeno. However, the one that you mentioned, the arrow, is rather different.
Okay. He doesn't tell him why. I know why. He's alluding to the calculus solution. People think that calculus solves the turtle paradox. It doesn't. There's a strange idea people have that in calculus you actually do perform an infinite series calculation. You don't. Both derivatives and integrals do not do this. I'm not going to go bother in explaining why. You can find out yourself. Look up how calculus actually works. There is no infinite summation going on. The issue of Achilles and the turtle is just that issue. It's the issue of continuum versus discreetness. The whole issue is with Achilles, there's a turtle. The turtle goes first, and Achilles has to race to beat the turtle. But in order for Achilles to reach the turtle and overtake the turtle, first he has to get halfway there. But first he has to get halfway to the halfway, and then halfway to the halfway to the halfway, on and on and on, because the continuum keeps on dividing. And you have this infinite series where it doesn't matter how much you do, however fast you do it, you cannot overcome the division. If you actually look it up, Kant really gets to the core of this in the antinomies of the Critique of Pure Reason. It's one of the it's actually 2 of the cosmological antinomies, where the problem is just clearly about how does a series of that kind works, and what would it mean to complete that series? There is no meaning to completing an infinite series, because there is no infinite quantity. There is no place it actually begins. There is no place it actually ends. For every time that you divide the distance between the turtle and Achilles, you can always subdivide and subdivide and subdivide and subdivide. There is no point at which you have some totality that you can actually do something with. You can't even count up the divisions to do an operation on the divisions. So this whole idea that calculus solves this is ridiculous. It has nothing to do with this. So the fact that he alludes to this, because he can't be alluding to anything else, as far as I know, nobody else ever offers anything. Everybody says, oh yeah, obviously calculus solves it. No.
And it goes like this. Let's take the arrow. Suppose I fire it from my bow, and it makes its way to the target. Now, take some instant of the motion. At an instant, the arrow makes zero progress on its journey because it is an instant, and it cannot occupy more than a single place at that instant. So it makes zero progress, doesn't get any further. Okay. So progress at any instant is zero. Now, at least according to sort of standard mathematics and physics, the time between my firing the arrow and it hitting the target is made up of those instants. So at each instant, it makes zero progress. So if at each instant it makes zero progress, it can't make any progress over the whole period because you can add 0 to 0 as many times as you like, even uncountably many infinitely times, and you still get 0. So the argument goes, the argument cannot move. It cannot get from the bow to the target. That's Zeno's arrow paradox.
Mm-hmm. So why can't measure theory overcome this?
Well, yeah, look, it can in a certain sense. So if you try and apply standard measure theory to this, it depends on the thought that if you have a bunch of intervals with non-zero measure, or with zero measure rather, and you add them all together and consider the measure of the sum, then this can have non-zero measure, provided there's enough of these things. And you need an uncountable number to do it, but that's okay. So that's some mathematics, but the problem is not about mathematics. The problem is about how the arrow manages to actually move. And that's not going to be solved by mathematics. You need to tell a story of something else, something that relates to the real world to do this. If you assume that you can add an uncountable number of intervals with zero measure together, and you get something with non-zero measure, that's true. But I mean, how is it that reality answers to that bit of mathematics? You know, there are going to be other bits of mathematics you could use. You could have a different kind of measure theory. Why choose that one? Well, because the one you choose has got to apply to reality in some sense. So what is it in reality that makes that the appropriate bit of mathematics? And that's the real problem, I think.
All right. That math thing is just ridiculous to me. Now, I don't know about, I haven't actually looked into, the reasoning behind it, but just, on a conceptual level, the whole idea, oh, yeah, I can have, an infinite summation of zeros and somehow, or in some kind of infinite set and operation on non-quantities and get a quantity out of it is ridiculous. That's just completely illogical. But I'll let that slide. The issue of the arrow is just an issue of discreteness. Actually, let me see. I think I'm having a... Can you guys hear me fine? Because I just noticed that my my mic wasn't showing that it was lighting up. Okay, well, right now it does. Anyway, so the issue of the arrow is a problem of discreteness. So, the turtle is kind of, they're inverted problems. The turtle is about the continuum, and the arrow is about discreteness. With the arrow, you have discrete moments, but, a moment of time is itself non-temporal. But if time is composed of moments and they're non-temporal, how does temporality arise in the first place? And indeed, that's a conceptual problem. But likewise, if the continuum is the actual, like, real thing underlying the apparency of discrete moments, which can all be subdivided infinitely into a continuum, that's also a conceptual problem. Neither of these is ultimately actually a mathematical problem. Math cannot solve either the turtle nor the arrow. No, neither the turtle nor the arrow. And I just find it ridiculous that someone who's considered a world-class philosopher and logician on this stuff isn't aware of this. That's kind of crazy to me. That's why I posted, when I first saw this, I posted on Twitter that I thought in the first 10 minutes, the explanation he had given about these paradoxes is kind of a set of arguments for why Graham Priest is a moron. Because if I'm aware of this... Yeah, go ahead.
You said you were recording. So yeah, because I want to kind of review these with my friend who knows a lot more about Graham Priest. So I'm taking some notes here, but if you're recording it, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. So I was just saying, like, if I know that the fundamental issue of these is between the continuum and discreteness, one of them concerning how an infinite series as such is impossible, let alone any operation of an infinite kind in a quantitative sense is impossible. And then the second one is about more the ontological status of how you can go from a discreteness of something that is not moving, which is supposed to be the basis of something that moves, is also like is a different relationship, but it's still like kind of goes the same. Hegel's solution to them is like just saying Zeno was right. The paradox is indeed a paradox. Actually, Hegel solves these at the very end of chapter 1 of the Philosophy of Nature, where he brings up that it is an issue of the continuum and discreteness. And he says, well, insofar as the continuum as continuum can be understood, and continuum is only a continuum of quantized discrete parts, and therefore the understanding of the concept of continuity necessarily is entangled with the concept of discreteness. But likewise, insofar as discretes are separated as discrete, what separates them is not yet another discrete thing, but is this indeterminate continuum which negatively unites them. And Hegel particularly just points out that as far as motion is concerned, motion is indeed, by standards of classical logic, a paradox. That what Zeno says that somehow what motion requires is that at the same time, in the same moment that I am here in one place, I am also not here and I'm in some other place. And Hegel's answer is that, yeah, that's exactly how it works. That insofar as I am in one place, in the very being of that place, I am necessarily not there at the same time. I am in two places at once, and I'm also not in those two places at once. That what it is to be a place for Hegel means a temporalized space. And a place in its own logic as a temporalized space places itself or is placed in an external relationship to another place. So to be a place is also to just be in a negative relationship to another place. But in Hegel's logic, the way things work is not like here's one place and here's another, like as quantitatively distinct. It's universal. So it's here's the category of place and there's the category of place. But these are the exact same category, and yet they are distinguished within that category itself, so that you have the same thing that is itself and not itself. And in the abstract saying of this, like, it probably sounds like a bunch of gobbledygook, but it isn't. There's not much else I can say about that. Let's see what he says about paradoxes in general.
So this is seen as a paradox, and there are various types of paradoxes. Most people think of paradox as the same as contradiction, but there are at least three. Can you please delineate them? The reason being that paradox is going to come up again and again in this entire interview. So we may as well be specific as to what we're speaking about.
So normally I think there are two, the veridical and the falsidical. I'm not quite sure what you're thinking of as the third, but you can tell me.
Antinomy, so self-contradictory.
Oh.
So a veridical would contradict our intuition, and a falsidical seems true, but there's some fallacy in its...
Okay, so look, let's take a step back. What is a paradox? Okay, and the standard definition of a paradox... Look, everything in philosophy is contentious, right? But what most people will say, and I think it's right, is that a paradox is an argument, for a start. It's an argument that proceeds from premises that appear to be true, with steps of inference that appear to be valid, and yet the conclusion, you deduce something which isn't true. Maybe can't be true, but certainly isn't true, right? So you're starting off with these things which appear to be true to you, making inferential steps that appear to be right. You end up with something you can't accept. That's the paradox. Now, if you take that as your definition of a paradox, you've got two choices. Either there's something wrong with the argument, or the argument's fine and you have to accept the conclusion. Okay. And usually the ones where you accept the conclusion on reflection are called veridical. So you might have thought you couldn't accept the paradox, but you can. A paradoxical conclusion, but you can. And the falsidical ones is where something's gone wrong with the argument. And then, of course, we worry about what the argument is. And there are both kinds in the history of philosophy. So, for example, the liar paradox, which we can come back and talk about if you want to, is usually taken to be a falsidical paradox. People think there's something wrong with the argument. And the name of the game for 2,500 years has been find out what it is. But there are other paradoxical arguments which have which are now thought to be veridical. So a very standard paradox until the late 19th century was it's sometimes called Galileo's paradox, but it was known a long time before him, that if you take the natural numbers 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc., and you take the even numbers 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, and so on, then you can put those into one-to-one correspondence. You pair off 0 with 0, 2 with 1, 4 with 2, 6 with 3, and so on. So there's a one-to-one correspondence between the even numbers and the natural numbers, okay? And so it seems that there's the same number of each because they can be put into one-to-one correspondence. But it seems plausible that, there's got to be more natural numbers than even numbers because you've thrown away all the odd ones. Okay, so this was a standard paradox until the end of the 19th century in the work of a mathematician called Cantor on the infinite. And now the standard response in mathematics is, well, you thought that the naturals and the evens have a different number of numbers, but you're wrong. They actually do have the same, they're actually the same number of natural numbers and even natural numbers. And, puzzling as that may seem at first, that is now thought to be true. So there's a paradox which has turned out to be veridical in modern mathematics. You thought you couldn't accept the conclusion, but it's counterintuitive for sure, but okay, it is true, and that's the way that things work. And then you tell a story about set theory to explain why.
Okay. So just going to comment on He says a paradox is an argument that proceeds from premises that appear to be true, with steps of inference that appear to be valid, with a conclusion that isn't true. That's not necessarily how I ever learned about it. It's not just any argument that you can construct in that way. A paradox is an argument, as far as I know, at least in the ones that actually matter, is that there's something conceptually, like logically inherent to the very positions that you're putting forward, that in playing them out truthfully with them, their consequences lead to the entailment of something that negates that initial premise. So, I mean, something like the Galileo paradox is not a paradox by that standard. The liar paradox is a paradox by that standard. Something like the ontological argument for God, for example, counts as a paradox under that argument, because it's a paradox in which, okay, you accept a certain definition of God on the ontological argument, say God is the most conceivable thing. The atheist says, okay, fine, I'll accept the definition. And then the atheist goes and says, but God is still just a thing that I imagine. But by the very definition you put forth, that can't be the case. You're placing a reductio ad absurdum position, and it's not a paradox as such. It's only a paradox insofar as you're obstinate and try to claim something that's counter to what is actually inherent to the logic that you've supposedly accepted. So even something like the ontological argument is not really properly a paradox. Neither is the liar's paradox really in the end, either way. I have this post saved by Zoran, I don't know where I have it, in which he particularly goes into the details as to why the liar's paradox is just a complete fiction. It's something in which you set up the thing to be a paradox. It's not that it is a paradox in and of itself. You set up a purely self-referential sentence that really in itself is utterly meaningless. It's just two values pointing at each other. You say this sentence is false, or you can just so long as you set it as any kind of self-reference of a false-true dichotomy, you're just going to get the natural logic of an inversion, because one of them points to the other. Well, no, shit ends up being a paradox. You've built it that way. So even the liar isn't really a paradox. But if there's going to be anything that is a paradox, it really is a self-referential paradox. And he talks about this in another of the sections where he says that there's a contention about whether all paradoxes are in essence actually self-references or not. I think that they are. It doesn't make sense any other way that they would be, because any other way that they aren't is just like the Galileo paradox. That's not a paradox. That's just something unintuitive. If you understand the way in which quantitative infinity works, you perfectly understand why any set of numbers in any kind of ordering pattern, no matter what, can be set in correspondence to each other. And since there is no end to any of them, technically they all have equally the same amount in total. But that's itself a misunderstanding, because there is no set amount which these are in total. There is no beginning or end to the natural numbers in essence, nor is there a beginning and end to the evens, odds, or whatever. They're infinite. They don't end. So there's no final set in which, like, here I have this full set, here's how many there are, and here's I have this full set of the other one, here's how many there are. You can't make a comparison of that kind. So, at least in principle, all you can say is like, sure, yeah, I can, for every number that I posit on each set, I can always add one more of that kind, and therefore they'll always be in parity if I want to make some kind of quantitative account of them. But there is no final quantitative account, so that's not really a paradox at all. Him pointing out that Cantor solves this is ridiculous. Anybody who would have thought what this meant would have known this long ago. Of course, man, that's probably hindsight, 2020 kind of situation with us. Especially once you get into the kind of thinking that German idealism deals with, in which a lot of things are just so obvious. You don't need any fancy set theory or anything like that. For a while, actually today, what is it? A lot of people still put forth, what's his name? Hilbert's view of this, where Hilbert thought, oh no, they clearly are different. There are smaller and bigger infinities, such that the natural the infinity of the infinite set of the natural numbers is a bigger set than the infinite set of the even numbers, which is a bigger set than, the amount of numbers within, the decimals within, number 1 from 0 to 1, and so on and so on. And Hilbert thought that you can say, oh, these are actually they're bigger infinities than each other, which doesn't really make any sense if you understand what infinity is. Only under a very abstract notion in which you're not comparing these things can you go ahead and believe that there are more natural numbers than there are even numbers. The veridical versus falsitical distinction is just a spurious distinction in my view. I don't see why you would make it except for false paradoxes to begin with. It has nothing to do with whether you can accept a conclusion or if there's something wrong with the argument. Indeed, whenever you encounter a paradox, before you understand categorical thinking, conceptual thinking, like Hegel and the German idealist, and even people like Plato can engage in, the only proper response that you ought to have to any paradox is indeed to just assume there's something wrong with the way the problem is posed. And oftentimes this is historically how a lot of people went about trying to solve these things. Something must be wrong with the argument. Something must be wrong with the premises. So if it wasn't, the actual thinking process or the logical inferences that was wrong, it must have been the premises themselves that was wrong. So this is why people so often try to redefine identity, differences, all these kind of things, and to try to get just the just right definition that wouldn't lead to the paradox. And you can do that on different layers. There's a book that I like. What is it? Skepticism and Transcendental Arguments in German Idealism, I think. And that one goes over the history from Leibniz to Fichte. And it shows you how these problems of paradoxes crop up in these philosophies. And the next step is always somebody goes like, okay, the way this was defined in the prior philosophy, there was something wrong with it, so let's redefine it so that the problem doesn't arise. And what ends up happening is that the problem actually gets transferred to another area which was unforeseen. So that if you fix a problem that has to do with the definition of substance, for example, somehow this ends up appearing in some other thing. With Kant tries to fix certain problems with the metaphysical portions of Leibniz and Wolff's philosophies, or rather Leibniz-Wolff philosophy, and it ends up reappearing in his epistemic concerns. And so you have this like whack-a-mole game where genuine paradoxes cannot be solved by a redefinition of premises. So with genuine paradoxes, it has nothing to do with veridical, whether you can accept it or whether it's wrong, because it's something inherent to the very conception itself, and the concept is not up to your subjective opinion. No matter how you redefine it, the problem will peek its head in some manner within like your own system of philosophy, no matter what.
Additionally, because we're going to be speaking about logic, it would be great to get a definition of logic.
Look, that's a hard question, and it's hammered around in the philosophical literature by philosophers and logicians.
Well, just for the people who are watching and maybe they skipped the introduction and they're not aware of who you are, you're a preeminent philosopher. In fact, you have the title of Distinguished Philosopher at the City University of New York. And furthermore, you've written what's considered to be the go-to text in logic, which is the very short introduction to logic. So you know what you're talking about. And when you laugh, you're laughing for a particular reason. This isn't just someone who hasn't studied logic or studied it at the surface level. You're deep in it. You're the source of it in a sense. So
well, I don't
please
know
explain.
about that. But I'm certainly a logician, okay? So I laughed because you're asking a contentious question because people disagree about that. And the word has been used in many different ways in many traditions over the last 2,500 years. So let me just tell you how, how contemporary logicians tend to understand the nature of logic. But even that's contentious. But as a first cut, it's something like this. We argue, that is, we give reasons. And reasons start from premises, that is, things that you assume for the sake of the argument, and then steps in the argument which take you to your conclusion. Okay. Now, whether or not the premises are true will in general be someone else's business. So if we're arguing about something in geography, whether something's a geographical fact is going to be the business of the geographer. Similarly for history or psychology or whatever. But what a logician is interested in is, given the places you start, what are the legitimate steps that you can use thereafter? So what are the legitimate forms of inference? And logic is the study of answers to that question. So if I'm arguing with you about something, you may use a form of inference, and then it's up to the logician to tell you whether or not it's valid, whether or not, it is a good step in the argument. So in a nutshell, most modern logicians would tell you that logic is the study of what follows from what, and of course why, because saying yes or no is a bit boring. You've got to understand why.
Okay, so it's akin to following the rules of the game, and then sometimes you can argue about why some rules are more applicable to this universe than others. And when someone's making an argument,
it's about what the right rules of the game are. So an analogy, not to be pushed too far, is with grammar. So we speak a natural language. Let's take English, since we're both speaking English now. What grammarians do is try to figure out the rules of the grammar of that language. Okay, what are the rules which determine whether a sentence, a string is grammatical, the cat sat on the mat, or ungrammatical, like the cat sat is mat on. Okay? So grammarians, or linguists in general, try to figure out what the rules of that game is, if you want to call it a game. And what logicians do is try to figure out similar rules, not about grammaticality, but about validity, about when things follow from other things.
Now, you mentioned that we are given a set of axioms or a set of statements we believe are true, and then you say, okay, well, what follows from this? When we say that rules of inference are there to then bring you to some place. But you mentioned the starting places is not the place of logic. Is that always the case, or is there a form of logic that tries to bootstrap itself up?
Well, if your premises are about logic itself, then of course the truth of the premises is the logician's concern. But most arguments are not about logic, they're about something else. But yes, you're right. I mean, in unusual cases, the premises could be about logic as well.
The reason I'm asking is that there's a philosopher named Christopher Langan. I'm not sure if you've heard of him, but he's known for the cognitive theoretic model of the universe, which is an attempt to build a language or a meta language that describes the universe. But anyhow, what I would like to talk about is this conversation. Again, we're going to get more deep into the weeds. This whole conversation will stand on three legs: logic, truth, and then reference, because we're going to be speaking about the liar's paradox and other forms of paradoxes, and even nothingness and everything. So what are the...
All right, so just some comments on the logic thing. Typical formal logic stuff. So, I mean, for people who think that this guy's a Hegelian, I mean, they should have just cleared that up right away. He made no intimations towards the usual sense of logic that German idealists certainly use, which is not a formal logic at all. To give an example, I mean, the stuff he talks about, the But it has to do with arguments. We give reasons. We have premises. There's a series of steps for a deduction and a conclusion. A lot of classical philosophy doesn't work that way. Not only because before and even after Aristotle, there's plenty of people who don't put forth, here's premise 1, premise 2, and then, because of the link between them, we have a conclusion. Even today, a lot of quote-unquote philosophers don't do that. Even among analytics, who are the ones who are the most anal about this kind of logical formalism. Most people just maintain things to very simple, or as simple as one can imagine they can make it, natural language. And they don't stick to simply discussing issues of validity. I obviously prefer the German idealist notion of logic, where logic is just thought in general, the thinking of thinking, which is not simply stuck with rules of inferences. It's even beyond rules of inferences themselves. Because you don't need a rule of inference to think. There's content and you think it. If you're given a hammer and you're told, hammers to drive in, certain metal objects through other objects, like wood or whatever, nails into wood, and you smack it. That's the logic of the hammer. So, you're given a hammer, what do you do? What can you do? Well, given what it does, you can hammer a lot of things, at least as a job function. You have personal projects, or, maybe you can use it for unethical things like murdering somebody. But even then, the logic of the object is there as what it is and the purposes it has. And you could call those rules of inferences, but they're not rules of inferences really, because rules of inferences is just kind of things that, we kind of project on things like, oh, well, that's just how it makes sense to us. But given the way that the hammer is designed, the length of the handle, the shape of the head, the material of the head, the things that it's used for, are logically tied as within what that thing is. It's not some mere opinion of mine that a hammer is for hammering stuff. If I decide to use a hammer as an eating utensil, one, it's not a very good one. And second, that's a very expensive and a stupid waste of human labor for an eating utensil of that complexity. It doesn't make any sense. And that's one of the things that Hegelian logic can deal with. It can deal with the content of logic. So, he says what ultimately logic deals with just these rules of inferences, whether they're true or not, whether the actual premises are true or not, it's kind of irrelevant. All that matters to logic is validity. In German idealism and even classical philosophy, some stuff like Plato, you could deal with stuff which you're dealing with. What am I even talking about? What is the truth about this? And in that truth, say the truth of being or the truth of the one, something like in the Parmenides, what you're dealing with is what is logically consequent to this concept, not according to some rule of inference, but according to just what it means. If I tell you that, here's a thought object like being, call it being, and this thought object is supposed to be absolutely immediate, and if you understand what immediacy is, that there has no mediation in it, or around it, or beside it, or outside it, so that you understand that this thing can have no relationships. This is not some external rule of inference you have to apply the law of identity here, apply the law of the non-excluded middle, the law of non-contradiction. No, just think about it. Think about what it means to be absolutely immediate. The consequence of that, internal to that meaning, is just going to be that this cannot be a thing. It is not any specifiable object that I can point to. It will have no differentiation even from my own pointing or my own thinking, my own experience. No such thing can be done. And this is clearly possible. It's not something like people go ooh, it's mysterious. People have done it since forever. Even long before Plato, people were able to do this. So obviously, a logic that is far more versatile and far more meaningful has been available for a long, long time. It cannot be formalized, that is true, mainly because its objects of concern are themselves not merely formal objects or concrete objects. They're thought objects or world objects. Like I said, the hammer has a certain kind of logic. It functions in a certain way. It's made for a certain thing. And it's not a willy-nilly kind of thing that, I just decide to, do this en masse universally. If everybody uses hammers for spoons, that's a giant waste of social labor. And things might seem nice while they're free, but when you run out of stuff, it ain't so good.
I also wanted to add something about the regarding the logic and validity. Already the judgment or a judgment of any kind relating a subject and predicate is already conditioned by the concept of what that is. So like essentially the judgment being the concept in its particularity. So basically as saying that the concept must be expressed or distinct from itself, because if you have the concept being the universal, particular, and individual, then a particular is separate from the individual, but the individual is also separate or distinct from the particular. So the kind of thing that the individual is characterized by in being related to its particular has to express both the identity that they have in relation to one another as well as their distinction. Like the individual is particularity, but it is also not particularity, which is any judgment must express that through the is or the copula of the judgment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, he gave the example of the grammar. Grammar is also one of those things in which the structure of grammar, people don't think about this, and it's generally not pointed out. That is that the structure of grammar is based on judgments, the logic of judgments. It's not just some arbitrary thing. Such that we can indeed judge, this language is better in certain ways than this other language. There are better ways in which things can be expressed, not only because of concepts, but because even grammatical structures. So even then, logic is applying as a general thing. Of course, the thing that distinguishes logic as such is that logic is about pure thought operations, which Priest also talked about that there are logic may deal with truth insofar as it refers to logic itself, but formal logic doesn't have the kind of relationship to a content that something, say, like Hegel's logic does, where Hegel doesn't have to presuppose anything. You don't have to go about doing axioms or whatnot. You can just go ahead and do pure thinking a priori, see where that goes, if it goes anywhere, and from that see as a consequence what generalities develop out of that, such that then your logic is not just a he said she said kind of deal. It is provable as a fact of meaning that certain things do or do not apply. This is why there's various systems of logic, and what are they for, and Priest himself, like, is an advocate of Dialetheism, and he himself says, like, well, in Dialetheism, it's not that, you apply some kind of general rule of Dialetheism to things. It's just like there are certain things which, make sense that they would be dialetheic, that they would be contradictory, and so therefore, that you have the openness of Dialetheism available. For the rest of the parts, you can use modal logics and all these other things, and depending on what you're talking about, that's what you're going to use. Depending if you're talking about some kind of issue of possibility, well, then you're going to use modal logic to talk about it, and that's just talking about like ways of inferences of modalities that people talk about, that people think are valid or invalid, but even then, those things are up to question. So yeah,
the different theories of truth, and where do you stand on it? Obviously, there are too many to name, but let's say the predominant ones.
Yeah, okay. So the nature of truth has been hotly contested in philosophy, East and West, for 2,500 years, okay? And there's no consensus on the matter. So there are many different theories. As a first cut, you can distinguish between those that are realist in some sense and those that are non-realist. So the realist ones, I'll tell you something's true if it corresponds to reality. There's some stuff out there we call reality, and the true statements are the ones that have the appropriate kind of correspondence. And what that is, of course, highly contentious. But those are the sort of realist theories. Then the anti-realist theories are ones which do not like to talk about this kind of metaphysical notion of reality, and so they give some other kind of answer. And then there can be various kind of answers. So a very standard kind of answer is that what is true is not something that corresponds to some kind of reality, but something for which there is appropriate verification or evidence or something like that. So sometimes this kind of notion of truth is said to be epistemically loaded, because what makes something true is precisely its verifiability or the grounds for knowing that it's true or something like that. So there are a number of different theories which fall into those two categories. But as a first cut, that's a sort of rough distinction. And some theories of truth, they're kind of hard to sort of fit into that dichotomy. So it's complicated. I don't really have a horse in this game. I suppose I have a kind of temperamental disposition towards some kind of realism. But I think the matter is contentious.
Why do you say that?
Oh, that's just a comment on me. It's not a comment on the truth. That's just, the way I'm disposed to favour things. And that's a comment about me, not a comment about the subject. I mean, everybody has various dispositions in philosophy, as and everywhere else. Some people do have realist dispositions. If something's true, there's got to be a ground for it. What could that be? Well, it must be some kind of reality. Okay, and that's kind of an intuition that appeals to many people, including me. And some people think, no, talk of what's true in abstraction is sort of vacuous and misleading. I mean, truth is, just what we've got evidence for. And some people find this kind of intuition persuasive. I find that less persuasive, but I can see that there are arguments for it. So, sorry, that's a rather evasive answer to your question. But you can ask a dozen philosophers that question, you're going to get a dozen different answers.
Well, what I meant was more psychological. How is it that you even identified that this is your predilection or your affinity? You have an affinity toward a realist position. Is it because you noticed when someone is speaking from a realist point of view, you jive with them more, you're less anxious? Like, how is it that you even came to that realization?
The realist intuition is that truth does not float in midair. If something is true, there must be something that makes it so. Okay? And then what could that be? Well, look, here's something that's true. Melbourne is in Australia. What makes that true? Well, I mean, it's partly the meanings of the words, like the meaning of the word Australia, the meaning of the word Melbourne. But in the last instance, what makes that true is a bit of geography about, a continent in the southern hemisphere of our planet. So
Would that be the case always? Because even an idealist, at least many idealists would say that what makes something true is that it corresponds to mind. Now, they may just not say it's reality, they may say it's mind, but they would also say that there does exist illusory concepts or illusory facts or illusory experiences, and it's because they don't correspond in some way to the ground of reality, which itself is mind. It's just they have a different ground.
Okay, so there are plenty of real idealists, and those are usually... So you raise the question of idealism, and idealism is... There are many different kinds, okay, but standardly, at least, most idealisms are taken to be some form of anti-realism. So there's no reality external to your mind, it's all in your mind. I guess I've never been disposed to that. Why? Because it seems to me that what makes it true that Melbourne is in Australia? It's not something in my mind. I mean, I can't make Melbourne somewhere else by just changing my mind about it. If I did, I'd just be mistaken. And, the same was true for the whole human race. If everyone was kind of befuzzled by some kind of social media and started to think that Melbourne was in New Zealand, well, they'd just be wrong. So, I mean, it does seem to me that, in some sense, facts about the world, or at least some of them, not all of them, but some of them have to be mind independent.
I believe there's a difference here between solipsism, so it's all in your mind, versus it's all in mind.
Correct.
So mind is the ground of reality.
Well, yeah. No, you're right. I mean, solipsism is the view that there's only one mind in the world. And if you hold that view, you could, I guess, be a realist as well. There's only one world. But most people who are solipsists would probably be some kind of idealist as well. That's true.
Earlier, you used the word intuition.
All right. So, the fact that he's not interested in truth, being a logician, not unexpected. Usually only epistemologists seem to care about that, and even they don't care about that very much. The fact that he gave the stereotypical, like, Philosophy 101 realist versus anti-realist, which is basically correspondence versus coherentist description of, the available theories of truth is pathetic, if I can say so. I mean, come on. Even I'm aware of other things. I think I found out about Heidegger's theory of truth very early on. Like Heidegger, for example. Heidegger has a great paper. If you've never read it, you should read it. About at least the first half of it. The second half of it, it's his own jargon that I generally don't understand. But the first half is actually concerns the correspondence theory of truth in relationship to what he calls the material theory of truth, or material truth, where you say, well, it's raining outside, well, because I look outside, it's the fact that it's raining, therefore my claim is true. It corresponds to the facts. The material theory of truth is completely reverse. That regarding the material, which what he's really talking about is like the conceptual meaning of what it is to rain. Regarding my knowledge of this meaning and what it is to rain, what it is to be rain, I look outside, and indeed the facts of the world correspond with the intelligibility of that structure of meaning. Therefore, it is true that it's raining. because it is the material. It corresponds to the intelligible materiality, or what it means materially to reign. So that's a great one. Hegel's own theory of truth is basically an intermix between all of them. It's a correspondence of concept to object. It's a correspondence of object to concept. It's a mutual correspondence, which is a coherence. And then ultimately it's a self-correspondence of the thing to itself. Because in a self-relationship, a concept which is a subjective process, and not subjective in like a conscious subject, but subjective in like it's a process developing within itself, generating parts, details of its whole, and then unifying with itself as a whole, which then relates it as a fully enclosed being, as an object to other fully enclosed self-generated beings, other objects. But even as an object, just individually, the thing corresponds to itself. The apple, for example, or the apple tree as a whole, engages in a process in which it closes in on itself as a specific individual object, and that in being this subjective self-maintaining process, which is resistant of other external pressures, which would interfere with its own nature, say birds drilling holes in the bark, or animals eating its fruits, or leaves. They may affect external contingent things about the tree, but they don't affect its essence. They don't affect its nature. They don't change it, and so the tree objects in this way to being changed in essence by other things. It remains itself, and it also has a process by which it may constantly and consistently maintains itself as itself. So that might sound like a bunch of like just circular jargon, but it's actually fully intelligible.
Yeah, and also I think maybe the clearest or the most relevant um, uh, part in the logic to this point, I think, is the essential relation, or the inner and the outer, where he talks about the thought of the thing, its inward reflection, um, grasping and giving content to the outer, or um, the expression, which is reflection into another. So this being kind of a specific to a kind of a response to you know the Kantian type of view that there is a irreconcilable division between thought and being, or what I conceive of or think, versus what is in the world.
Yep. To comment on the stuff with idealism, I kind of get why he said what he said about idealism, because like it's too much to explain to people what it isn't. The thing is that like what most analytics call idealism doesn't exist. Idealistic philosophy versus realistic philosophy, that distinction just kind of gets brought up very, very late in philosophical history. Even at the turn of, say, I think at the earliest you start seeing something that kind of looks like it is with the rationalist versus empiricist debate. And even then, it doesn't fall squarely into that. It's not until like the analytics come around that they really like focus on like, oh, this is idealism and that is realism. Even the German idealists, don't consider themselves to be engaging against some other like different schools or whatever. the whole thing that idealism is everything in your mind. There's only one guy, and even that one guy doesn't even fall within that. Bishop Berkeley is the only person in history who's ever intimated anything even close to the idea that everything is somehow a product of my mind. And even then, it doesn't even say that, because all he says, well, no, everything is an appearance within God's mind. The individual subject is not the origin of anything. Everything, things exist because God perceives them, and God is everywhere and perceiving at all times, which is why things remain when I'm not perceiving. And if you want to call that solipsism, that's just kind of stupid, because it's not the impetus of solipsism. Solipsism is usually the idea that my mind, not a mind, but my mind is the only mind in the universe, is that, I am somehow the totality of all reality, which is a ridiculous position insofar as, like, if you're going to claim that, you're claiming you're basically God. But how could you be God if, clearly, if you realize this, somehow you're not able to exercise the actual power to, say, have intellectual intuition and make the world just by your thinking, whatever you wish. There's that one joke about, the way to disprove, one of the best ways to disprove solipsism would be to get a convention of solipsists together. But that doesn't really work. At least in Hegelian sense, idealism just means that finite things are parts of the infinite. And it's both idealism in the sense of fictions, it's just an idea in your head, man. Finite things don't exist in and of themselves or for themselves. They are not independent beings in truth. And then there's the idea in the Platonic sense of the highest reality, the truth itself, true being. And so, like, the whole of reality is the idea, and then the finite little parts within it are idealizations, the little figments that seem to be objectively real, but in ultimate consequence are actually just fictitious in a way. But they're not fictitious in, like, they don't exist. They're fictitious in that they don't fully exist. Only, the idea, reality, God, whatever you want to call it, fully exist. So anyways, a really, really weak view that he has. I have a presentation on that. I might link it. Anyways, we'll skip the stuff on classical logic and intuitionism. That's just kind of formal stuff that I don't care about. We'll skip the liar's paradox.
As well.
So, Professor, why don't we talk about the liar's paradox? Your views on why contradictions just exist. They do correspond to something in reality.
So let's start off with the liar paradox, okay? Many of your listeners will know this, I guess, but many of them will not. So this is a very old paradox in Western philosophy, Western logic. We think it goes back to the ancient Greek thinker Eubulides. It was a rough contemporary of Aristotle, so, maybe 4th century BC. And the paradox essentially goes as follows. Suppose I tell you that Melbourne is in Australia. Is that true? Yeah, sure. Suppose I tell you that Melbourne is in China. Is that true? Well, no. Now pay attention. Suppose I say, look, this very sentence that I'm uttering now is not true. Is that true or false? Well, it's kind of hard to answer that question. Suppose it's true. Well, if it's true, it says that it's not true, so it's not true. So if it's true, it's not true. All right. Is it false? Well, if it's false, it's not true. And the very claim it's making is it's not true. So it seems to be true. So if it's false, it's true. So you seem to be in this very strange situation where if it's true, it's false, and if it's false, it's true. And the standard paraconsistent thought is that it's both true and false. So that explains why if it's true, it's false. If it's false, it's true, because it's both. Now, this is not the most popular account of the paradox, certainly historically, because coming back to the distinction we drew between veridical and falsidical paradoxes, the standard reaction in the history of Western logic has been that this is a falsidical paradox. You can't accept the conclusion because it's a contradiction. So the game in town has been to explain what goes wrong with the argument. And logicians have not been very successful if consensus is a mark of success, because 2,500 years after Ulysses, there's still no consensus on what's wrong with that argument. The paraconsistent move is, this is not a falsidical paradox, it's a veridical paradox. Namely, you accept the conclusion. The conclusion is that that sentence is true and false. Is that a contradiction? Yes. So some contradictions are true. That's the argument. Okay. Now, where the discussion goes, the discussion going many ways at this point. How do you want to proceed from here?
In math, there's a concept called.
Let's see. So again, the liar's paradox is not actually a paradox. I mean, it's the one time I'll accept this thing. It's what he calls falsidical. It doesn't mean anything. You know, like you say, this sentence is true. Well, true about what? You know, what is this sentence? What is that supposed to mean? It's an empty signifier. It's just like, this points directly, immediately to that, where this, in the positing of it, is assumed to be the case, and the case is the truth. And then you immediately apply falsehood to it. Like, the so-called paradox is not a paradox at all. It's literally cooked in. It's a badly formed statement. It's like what Chomsky says about false sentences that are meaningless, like green dreams run furiously or something. If you actually look at the semantic content of that, it doesn't mean anything. Likewise, the structure of that doesn't mean anything either. Even if you break it up by different levels and you say, oh, well, you can have a two-layered solution, which I forget who it is that came up with that one. That was like my solution when I first learned about this. I'm like, well, it's kind of obvious that this is a two-layered reference. In one layer, I'm referring to this sentence alone, and then I qualify it as false. And then from that second level, I can qualify whether it's true or false or not. But my ultimate position on that is like, well, this sentence isn't anything. Like, it doesn't say anything. There's no semantic content. It's an empty indexical. Indexicals have no truth or false value, especially when, like, you see the indexical is like, here's an indexical, and then immediately you qualify it, and like the indexical isn't here. Okay, so what? It's not important. It's not a very interesting thing. The actual liar's paradox comes from what is that myth? I don't remember the exact name, but it's that one Greek story. It's it's kind of a Sphinx paradox, where you have one that always tells the truth, the other one always tells lies, and somehow you're supposed to figure out the one question in which it's going to be revealed which one is which, so that what to ask.
That's Ulysses.
Oh, thank you. That's the only genuine paradox, and the paradox is not really a paradox as such, because it's also constructed. It's only a paradox insofar as you're trying. You have a presupposed goal, and you have somebody already that has told you. One of them always tells the truth. One of them always tells the lies. The liar can tell you that they'll always tell the truth, and the truth teller can also tell you that they will always tell lies, and they would neither be in contradiction to themselves in a certain way, but they also would. And actually, I have an article that I've never finished on that, even though I went into a lot of detail. So that's the only interesting form of the liar. Beyond that, you could consider everything in Hegel's stuff to be a sort of liar paradox, but it isn't, because because it doesn't cook into itself like I am a liar or this is false. Insofar as being is being, it is nothing. Insofar as nothing is nothing, it is being. That, when things are themselves, they necessarily are also not themselves. In abstraction, this sounds like gobbledygook, I know. But in reality, there are things that do this. You as a whole body, for example, or as a whole human being, body and mind, are one thing, which in being one thing is many. Even though normally we try to distinguish, no, I'm actually either I'm just reduced to the body, or I'm actually just the mind, I'm the soul, the spirit. The idea of a complex that must at the same time be treated as simple in some way is kind of antithetical to normal thinking, and yet it's a very natural thing to think once you actually start getting to thinking about it. When you look at the actual processes of what it is to be human, just like how you get like the zygotes that unify themselves in the womb, and you start out with one single cell inseminated by one sperm cell, and then it gets to the division, and the division leads to the organs and the general shape of the body, and it grows, and somehow this whole thing is as one unit, and the same as one unit, it has these differences which are essential to its being. If you don't get the hard development of the organs internally, you're not going to get a development of a human being out of that. You need those differentiations. But likewise, if you don't, so you would think that, the whole depends upon the parts, but then the parts don't exist without that guiding whole, whatever that whole might be. You might think about it as, some kind of field. You might think about it as some kind of spiritual, supernatural thing. It doesn't really matter. But there is some whole upon which these parts, without that whole, do not come about in the first place. And that's the only form of the liar's paradox that is really true. And it's not a liar's paradox. It's a paradox in which a thing being itself just inverts itself. That, when I understand one thing, I end up expanding into what it immediately is not. And yet I also understand that, those things that it is not also belong to it and are subsumed under it. And in the end, the paradox is not really a paradox. It's only a paradox for a certain kind of understanding. Which is also why I deny that Hegel's a dialetheist. What dialetheism invokes is a bad kind of unity of a true-false, which is unintelligible, and you just have to accept it. Whereas with Hegel, you have a dialectic. You don't really have a relationship of true-false. What you have is a relationship of a negative-negative or a positive-positive, whichever you want to see it, which are intelligibly and understandably united within a whole and also divided within it. The whole thing is fully understandable. The whole thing makes sense. The whole thing about paradox classically is that it doesn't make sense. If it made sense, we would accept it, and we wouldn't say, "Oh, well, this is a paradox. It's unintelligible." But no, it's intelligible. Therefore, we can accept it, and we must accept it. And why would you not accept it? It makes perfectly good sense. Of course, that's how it is. And of course, being is nothing. If I understand what it is, it clearly can't be anything. Of course, if there is nothing, it's the same as being, because it is. We'll skip the proof by contradiction thing. That was a very weird, long-winded thing. Let's see what he says, logic and time.
I was speaking with a quantum physicist named Nicholas Gissen. He's an intuitionist, and he suggested that intuitionist logic is intrinsically tied to time. Why? Because something remains undefined until a certain time. So the classic example is, will it rain tomorrow? Well, it's not truthful, it's not false, but it's undetermined until it's tomorrow, at which point it then becomes true or false. Okay. Paraconsistent logic. Does that have anything to do with time?
So just to point out, those things about those kind of problems are just so stupid to me. They're not philosophical. That's a big claim, but philosophy has to do with categories, these little empirical things. Oh, we forgot to mention about that linking the truth thing. There's a distinction that is so crucial and so valuable because it clarifies a lot of things between truth and correctness. The issue that he's talking about, between will it rain tomorrow or not, that kind of stuff belongs to correctness. And correctness is conventional. It depends on many ways of how you want to define things arbitrarily, and what we accept as answers. They have no essential truth. They could have nothing to do with truth. For example, poker. You can be correct about the rules of poker, how poker actually is played, but there's nothing essentially true about poker as poker regarding its specific rules. You can talk about poker as essentially true as a game. There are universal rules to what it is to be a game in essence. The fact that there are games that intelligent beings will play games, for example, those are necessary truths. But the rules of poker itself, any specific game, are just conventional. You can be correct about them, but they have nothing to do with it. You can be correct about probabilities. You can be correct about many things. You can be correct about, when was Napoleon born? When did he die? When did he die? When did this event occur? What date? What hour? Who was here? Was there? Those are all correct concerns, but they are not concerns of truth. The whole thing, is it true that it's going to rain tomorrow? And it's not true until it happens. Kind of irrelevant.
Look, it's true that on most understandings of intuitionistic mathematics, things can achieve a truth value they didn't have before because you've got a new proof. That's absolutely right. But you can have that in different other non-classical logics as well. The example you're using about future contingents, they're called, is usually taken to validate not intuitionistic logic, but a three-valued non-intuitionistic logic. Okay, so this thing about time is not that your person was pointing to is true, but it's not specific to intuitionistic logic. Okay, it works in a number of other logics as well. Whereas if you're a classical logic, you're not going to accept either of those because even if you don't know what's going to happen in the future, it's either true or it ain't now. Okay?
So now the question is, what's interesting is, look, some logics have some metaphysical implications with regard to time.
Yeah.
Now, does Paraconsistent have something similar?
Yeah.
Maybe it's not just with time, maybe it's with something else. Could be space, could be something else.
Well, look, time is a tricky subject. And a number of problems to do with time are highly contentious. Not the stuff you do in relativity theory. That's pretty standard, but there's lots more to time than just special relativity or general relativity. There's the sort of phenomenology of time. There's the flow of time. There's all kinds of problems with time, which aren't addressed by special relativity. And some of those problems can be addressed with a paraconsistent logic. It's kind of...
Just to make a joke, for any of you who know about the thing that Zizek says that space is literally the most stupid thing there is, I would say that about time as well. Time is more stupid than space. Like in the philosophy of nature, I think time takes up about 3 pages, and in reality, it's actually only about 2 paragraphs. The 3 pages are just these notes from the student lectures that go into details. They're kind of side comments. Hegel says time is just the negative unity of space. It's the non-spatial separation of a totality of space from space. This has no intrinsic order. There is no past-future distinction. It's just this separation. The past-future distinction can only happen with consciousness, where the past is that which is remembered, the future is that which is expected. So the past-future distinction does not belong to nature itself. So the fact that mathematically, you can reverse any operation of physics and it works just as well. It's just inherent to nature itself. Nature could run complete inverse and it would work just as well. As a matter of fact, if you actually take seriously such a thought experiment, that what if time as a whole ran in reverse? What would it look like? If time ran in reverse, but my consciousness did not run in reverse, because consciousness only makes sense as having the memory and expectation, orientation, such that suppose that what is now called the future becomes my past, and that what is now the past is reversed into my future. But I no longer remember the future, but now I remember. Well, I remember now what supposedly was the future in the events, but now my past becomes unknowable. The flow of time has to look exactly the same for me. When I throw a ball up, it'll come down the same way. When I break a glass, it will break the same way. It will literally make no difference to me what the actual objective flow of time is, because it has nothing to do with my actual conscious experience, because it is ordered under my conscious experience where I'm expecting a future. And the future is expected precisely because I don't yet know what I myself and what other beings are doing. That's what makes the future open. It has nothing to do with the flow of time itself. It has to do with my own experience, my memory, and my expectations. So the arrow of time thing is completely superfluous to the issue of time.
Going to be contentious, but there are some problems about time, philosophical problems about time, which are contentious. Now, look, let me give you one example. Think of...
Oh, and by the way, general relativity is wrong about time. You can take that to the bank. There's two contradictory senses in general relativity which are never clarified, where there's an appeal to an absolute sense of time while speaking of time as relativized. The whole thing about simultaneity of events, that things could happen at the same time, yet because of the light cone, they seem to happen at different times. This could only be intelligible from a meta-time perspective, which would be an absolute time in which you could tell that there could be such an incoherence in the first place. It ends up just being a mess.
With the flow of time, naively, we all think that there's stuff now, and then it goes into the past, and then new stuff happens. And, this is sort of partly to do with the open future that you were describing. But time seems to flow in some sense, Things start off as the future, become present, then become past. This is usually called the flow of time. There's no such thing as special relativity, but certainly that's the way that time appears to us. It's part of our phenomenology of time. Now, how do you account for that? Okay, as I say, there's no consensus on this, but the flow of time certainly does seem to lead you into contradictions, some very famous ones, in fact. One is one suggested by a British, actually Scottish philosopher, McTaggart, at the beginning of the 20th century. And McTaggart argued that flow of time is real, and that means that time is contradictory because nothing can be past, present, and future, but everything is past, present, and future. Okay, now there are various ways of replying to this, and McTaggart had various counter-replies and so on, but we don't go into that. We don't need to go into that here. All I'm pointing out is a number of people have thought that aspects of the nature of time generate contradictions. Now, you might disagree with the arguments, of course. But if you think those arguments are right, and you don't think that time is illusory, and so you just throw up your hands in horror, then...
By the way, McTaggart ruined so much of the discussion of time. I mean, mainly for analytics. But not that I care, because analytics don't count to me, but he did. He caused so much damage. It's kind of weird that that guy was considered a Hegelian. Because like his view is like so far from Hegel's. I mean, they obviously read German. That's why they... this is before Hegel was translated into English, but they could read German, so... he had to be aware of what Hegel's philosophy of nature, just completely ignored it. McTaggart has a whole book commenting on the science of logic, I think. And I was reading, I started reading like a couple of pages from it, and he thinks he can do it better than Hegel. Which I disagree. I think he completely missed the point on a lot of things.
And if time is contradictory, when we reason about time, we're going to need a paraconsistent logic. So it could well be that various aspects of time will require a paraconsistent logic if you're going to reason about them sensibly. I mean, this is very contentious, but everything about this area of time, once you get beyond special relativity, is contentious, I'm afraid.
So the tricky part here is that often in philosophy, you find that some statement is contradictory or some concept is contradictory. And that leads you to investigate it further and find that you were using ambiguous terms or you need to explicate further. You get the idea. And it leads you to some further insight. The issue with paraconsistence that I'm sure you've thought of is that if we're going to accept contradictions, then how do we know we're not prematurely accepting a contradiction?
How do you know how do you ever know you're not accepting something prematurely? Look, our views all change all the time. Okay, they can always, we can always find out we're wrong. That's a hard fact of, adult life.
Not true. So one of the things I love about Hegel, you can know pretty immediately whether the thing is or is not contradictory, why it's contradictory, and you're not going to find out a year down the line or 2 years or 100 years down the line or 1,000 years that it was wrong, because it has everything to do with a purely semantic understanding. You're not going to find out 1,000 years from now that actually squares really have 5 sides. That's asinine. The meaning of a square is something that, on at least a 2D plane, that's a flat 2D plane, not within some 3D plane that is bent or a higher dimension. Something that is an enclosure of equidistant lines joining at right angles, enclosing a total space with those requirements can only create a 4-sided figure with right angles. That's what a square is. It's going to be no different in the past, and it's going to be no different in the future. So, what Kurt asks is very reasonable, and his answer is very unreasonable. I mean, this is just misunderstanding what categorical thinking, conceptual thinking is really about. But, I'll forgive him because he doesn't claim to be a conceptual thinker. He just claims to be a logician. So, all these things that he says are contentious. They're not really contentious. No more contentious than, scientific facts may be contentious, Is it a fact that the sun, is up in the sky and the earth circles around the sun? Yes. It's contentious to morons. That is true. But morons have no say in truth. The truth is not a democracy, so that the contentiousness of things amongst people who are not in the know of such things is kind of irrelevant. Well, not kind of irrelevant, it just is irrelevant. You can be the single person going against the world, and the rest of the world says, no, X is Y, and you say, no, X is X. You are right. You're in the right, you have the truth. Whether other people agree with it or not is kind of irrelevant. This is one of the worst things that philosophers do to people. They destroy their capacity to have the proper faith and reason to judge when things are the case and are not the case. This whole idea, well, nobody knows, some people believe this, some people believe that. There are reasons for believing specific things. And sure, a lot of people have groundless reasons, but you can have completely grounded reasons as well, such that you have all rational right and even a duty to ignore all these other naysayers. And it can be explained, and it's not something merely asserted.
But sometimes when you've got a theory and it generates a contradiction, then you want to change the theory, and that's the right thing to do. Sometimes it may not be. So, look, when you apply, when we're doing most things of any substance, physics, philosophy, moral philosophy, history, politics, we're dealing with things about which we have to theorize. And there are different theories. There's virtually no theoretical enterprise in which there aren't, or at least haven't been, competing theories. Now, if you subscribe to classical logic, if your theory turns out to be inconsistent, you say, hey, it's wrong. We've got to look for a consistent theory, right? Mm-hmm. If you're a paraconsistent logic and you get to an inconsistent theory, you can say the same. Maybe there's something wrong, and let's look for another theory. But something you might say is, well, maybe the phenomenon we're dealing with really is inconsistent. So it puts another possibility onto the table. So you're not losing anything, you're gaining extra possibilities. So you already had a bunch of different theories to choose from. Some have now gone because you've written them off a priori. But
this is just wrong. The whole thing, like, well, what if reality doesn't make sense? Is not an alternate theory. It's not another ingredient to add to the soup. It's not a soup. It's not an ingredient at all. It's basically just giving up. Now, like, for people who don't care about reality, giving up may be an option. But for those who actually do and want to keep being in reality, it's not. Actually, Hegel has an essay on philosophical criticism, I think is what it's called. It's actually an early essay of his. And he just it's basically against this kind of thinking of, Hegel would call what he's putting forth as non-philosophy or unphilosophy. Whereas these people who are fundamentally relativists, who deny that there is a final system, that there is a one single truth, and that we can actually get at it. And I'm not saying even he's denying it, because he's just kind of leaving it open. Well, maybe. But the maybe is basically that. The maybe always leaves it open. It's like, well, I can't tell what is truth and what is not. Well, if you can't tell what is truth, what is not today, you're not going to be able to tell tomorrow. And you're not going to be able to tell 100 years from now. You're never going to be able to tell. If you're not already certain about something today, if you don't know for sure today, you're not going to be sure tomorrow. It's never going to happen. You can't go from a standpoint of, oh, maybe everything's up for grabs, and maybe everything is true or everything is false or something in between. Because even if truth strides, into the whole fray on a blazing white horse, with lights and everything, you'll just think truth is just another one amongst, this set of ingredients that's just ever growing. You won't be able to tell that truth is actually true.
You're still going to have a bunch of theories. Some of them are consistent, some of them are inconsistent, and you choose the best theory. Okay, how do you choose the best theory? Well, that's a sort of standard problem in the philosophy of science. You choose the theory which answers best to the data, which is simplest, most unifying. These are standard criteria from the philosophy of science. And sometimes it may well be that the inconsistent theory fares badly than some of the consistent theories. Maybe that's often going to be the case, but maybe it's not. So, just come back to the liar paradox. We've been constructing theories most of which have been consistent for 2,500 years. None of them seems to work, at least if consensus is a mark of working.
Mm-hmm.
So
Right.
now we've got another possibility on the table. The theory of truth is inconsistent. Let's compare that theory with all the other theories and see which fares best.
When talking about paradoxes,
None of them seem to work, so let's just accept them not working, and now like not working works. Yeah, his criterion of truth is appeal to popularity.
something I wondered is paradox exclusively a property of self-referential systems? So the liar's paradox is self-referential. But then you just outlined the McTaggart time paradox. So that doesn't seem to be referring to itself,
No, look,
is it?
philosophers disagree about this. Some philosophers have argued that all dialetheas, all true contradictions, were generated by self-reference. So there's an American logician, J.C. Beale, who argued this at one time. I'm laughing because he's recently changed his mind, and he now thinks that's false, and he thinks that God can be inconsistent too. Okay, I'm not going to go down that path. But, at least 30 years ago or 20 years ago, that was his view, that all dialetheas were generated by self-reference. But I've never held that this is the case. Maybe the paradox of self-reference are the most striking, but I think there are other very plausible examples. And, we've talked about motion. That's another one. And there are others that I find very plausible.
Now, Professor, something that is extremely interesting is you have a talk.
So, I already mentioned it, but I'll mention it again. Yeah, all paradoxes are self-referential. They're self-operations. That's what makes them nonsensical. That you try to execute something, and what's it called? It's like a performative contradiction. You think something's going to lead to something else. You do it, and it doesn't lead to what you thought, because the actual action and what's inherent to it are contradictory to the action itself. Identity, for example, is a simple one. Whenever I identify, I'm implicitly appealing to differences to unify in an identity in the first place. Even when you say, well, A equals A, I am somehow differentiating A for a moment, splitting it off from itself, making A and not A at the same B, or rather, A be not itself in a way so that A here and A there are not the same thing. Despite the fact that categorically I am appealing to the same thing. So somehow A is not A, and then through the identity I reunified and collapsed it again. Simple stuff like that. It's either it is a performative contradiction that if you try to actually actualize identity, you need differences to unify. Likewise, if you have differences, you need to actualize some identities to be different in the first place for difference to actually be the case. Intelligibly or as a matter of fact. This involves both a performative, just engagement of that being itself, and also you can look at it as a self-reference. In order for difference to be different, which is really a reference of difference to difference, what has to be different has to be identical in that way. Because if different is different to difference, the only way to do that is it has to be identical to itself. Therefore not different, or rather, in the fact that it is different to itself, so that it is different, it is identical precisely because it is actually different to its own difference. Those are self-referential, they're self-operative. Even in a basic thing like saying that being is, the being of being, somehow is not being. Being is somehow other than what it is immediately, because I can make the split in the first place between something substantive being and its active being, which should not be possible. And yet I must logically do this. And somehow also when I understand the ontology of things, it has to be this way as well. Otherwise nothing would ever be the case. And if nothing was the case, it would also immediately be a contradiction, because then it would be the case and nothing would be. And it's inescapable. There is no such thing as a genuine paradox that is not going to be self-referential. The things like the liar, for example, it's a cooked up self-reference. It's not a true self-reference. The stuff you pointed out earlier about Galileo's paradox, that's not a real paradox either. It's not a self-reference either. He's going to point out something later on about the Sorites paradox. That's not a paradox either.
Too, which is what I've always understood those as just being issues of self-reference.
So let's see, supervenience, ontological dependence.
Which again will be linked in the description, and I believe I referenced it in the introduction. It is everything and nothing. Yes, this is a wonderful talk. So the reason I say that is that I just watched it recently. I can tell when I watch something whether it will stay with me for a while, and this is one of those that I'll be thinking about for some time. It also is extremely accessible to the public. Like, there's not much background knowledge. In fact, some background knowledge will hinder you from understanding it. I say that because there's a lowercase sigma for sums. And I'm like, oh, just use the uppercase sigma, because then I could read it like that, but now I have to apply some second order thinking to it. But anyhow, in it, you argue that not only is nothing, or nothingness, which we can talk about, not only is nothingness contradictory, but it is the ground of reality. And you explain that as either as ontological dependence, which I don't know if that's the same as supervenience.
No, it isn't.
So I would like to know, what is the difference between ontological dependence and supervenience before we go on?
Well, I'm just trying to think how to put this in simple terms. Okay. Let's take supervenience first. Supervenience occurs when you've got two levels of reality, so to speak. And you can't have a change in the more superficial level without a change in the more fundamental level. So one context in which that's often appealed to is the philosophy of mind. So, we have mental states. Some people think those are completely different from physical states of our body and our brain. Some people have held that you can reduce mental states to physical states. So you can define a mental state in terms of physical states. Both those views face steep problems. Another view is that the mental supervenes on the physical. So you can't actually define the mental in terms of the physical. But what you can say is that in some sense, there's a sort of dependence relation that you can't have two different mental states without some different physical states. And that's supervenience. The supervening phenomenon, you can't have a change in the supervening phenomenon without a change in the subvenient phenomenon. That's supervenience. Okay? Ontological dependence is this, that... Okay, and it comes in various different forms, so let me try and keep this simple. One very common form is that the nature of something depends on something else. So, for example, it might be said that your being a human depends upon your genetic structure. Actually, let me give you, I think, a better example that can be appealed to. Suppose you've got a tree and the sun's out and you've got a shadow of a tree. The shadow of the tree depends for being a shadow of a tree on the tree. But the tree doesn't depend for being a tree on the shadow of a tree. Okay.
Understood.
Now, this is not the same as the supervenient picture. I mean, you don't have two levels of reality for a start, because shadows, trees are all part of the same reality. So this is not a relation of supervenience, but it is taken to be a relation of ontological dependence.
Okay. So now let's explore, what is the difference between nothing and nothingness?
Okay. The word nothing in English and cognate words in other languages is ambiguous. The word nothing can be a quantifier. which means that it's not a referring term. Quantifier phrases tell you that quantifier phrases things like something, everything, few, many, most, and it tells you whether something, everything, few, many, most things satisfy some condition. These are not, quantifier phrases are not referring phrases. And if I say, she opened the fridge and there was nothing there inside, that's a quantifier. It's saying for no X was X inside the fridge. It was empty, right? So often when we use the word nothing, it's a quantifier phrase. But nothing can also be a noun phrase. So it does refer to something. Well, if it refers at all, that's contentious. But if it refers, it's the kind of phrase that refers to something. That's what a noun phrase is. So if I say Hegel and Heidegger wrote about nothing but said different things about it, the word nothing there is a noun phrase. How do you tell? Well, there's this anaphoric pronoun, it, and it refers back to whatever nothing is referring to. So nothing must refer to something. Okay. So when we're talking about nothing, and we're not talking about the quantifier, we usually mean it as a noun phrase, something that refers. And in English, we often put the suffix, the postfix, ness on the end, nothingness, to make it clear that it's a noun. In German, in other languages, you would put a definite description in front of it, das nicht, which you don't do in English, right? We don't talk about the nothingness in English. But we have various devices which we use in most languages to tell you you're talking about the noun phrase and not the quantifier.
Okay.
And certainly in that lecture that you mentioned, I was talking about nothingness, that is nothing qua noun phrase, not qua quantifier, which is quite different.
So again, the lecture will be on screen here. I'll show an image of it, and the link will be in the description. I recommend you watch that because there.
I don't think that's a meaningful distinction in the end. I mean, if you're talking about like, oh well, there's nothing there as a quantity. It's still the same nothing. I mean, sure, it's not the ultimate nothing, but it's basically just like a sub-use of it. I mean, you're not really fundamentally meaning anything different. In one of them, you're focusing on just like the thing itself. The other ones, you're using a certain qualification. Because in the same way, you can talk about oneness, two-ness, three-ness. It just seems like such a weird quibble. No normal person would like mistake it, I think. I've never certainly mistook it.
There's a formal proof that the notion of nothingness, given some assumptions, and which are reasonable assumptions, given what we think the properties of nothing should be, lead to nothing being contradictory, but also that every object is dependent on nothing. So this is metaphysically interesting.
And contentious.
Right. Now, I want to leave that as a teaser, which we'll come back to. And there's a flip side to nothing, or nothingness, which is everything. Yeah. So please define what everything is and talk about whether it itself is a well-defined notion.
Okay, look, all this stuff is contentious. I think both nothingness and everythingness, if I can use a kind of very strange way of putting it, are both fine. Now, I gave that lecture that you're referring to in Bonn, and I was invited by a philosopher there called Marcus Gabriel.
Mm-hmm. If you don't know who Marcus Gabriel is, he's probably the greatest disappointment of living philosophers. I think he's like the youngest full professor ever, second to Schelling, the German idealist. If you see some of his early talks, especially when he talks about German idealism, he's generally good. Like, so long as he doesn't interject like his own thinking, he's actually all right. It's his own thinking that is just like stupid. And if you ever seen him on Twitter, he's a typical liberal in like the most pejorative sense. The guy is just like a brain dead moron when it comes to like anything outside of like the niche of which he specializes in philosophy. Absolutely stupid.
Who has made quite a name for himself, arguing that there's no such thing as everything. There's no totality of everything, right?
Oh, okay. So when you were saying in the lecture,
Yeah, that's one of his stupid ideas. There's only contingency, there's only finite things, but there is no final unity, you know, which is God, the universe, or everything. Things like he originally started talking about this whole thing like, oh, well, you know, reality itself isn't real. But I mean, like, that kind of stuff is just like pop philosophy garbage, man.
that Marcus said so-and-so, it wasn't Marx. You weren't speaking about Karl Marx. Okay, because I was wondering, I thought, has Karl Marx spoken about everything? No. Because it sounded every time you said Marcus said, I thought you said Marx
Karl
has
Marx
said
is
so-and-so.
at least on that level higher
No,
than
I'm
Marcus
talking about
Gabriel.
Marcus
It's
Gabriel,
my bad.
who was in the audience.
Yes, okay.
And in fact, Marcus and I have since written a book called Everything and Nothing.
Well, that's wonderful.
But Marcus does not think there's such a thing as everything, and I do. I think there's also such a thing as nothingness, and Marcus was a bit dubious about that, but that's a different matter. So the question is, how do you define these things? And in the case of everything, there's a standard definition in the branch of metaphysics or logic called Merology. Merology is the theory of parts and wholes. And everything is just the object you get when you put together everything. So it's a noun phrase.
Wow, that's like amazing insight. Could never have guessed.
Right? It's the Merological sum of everything.
I needed a group of PhD philosophers to tell me
quantifier.
that that's what everything
So
was.
you take all the things there are, you squish them together to get one single object, and that's everything. So in Merology, you've got this operation of fusion, which means if you take the parts of something and squish them all together, you get the thing in question. I have parts. I've got 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, a torso, etc., etc. If you put all those things together, you get me, okay?
Wow.
Or if you take Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, it's got 4 movements. If you put all those things together, you get the symphony. And the thought is everything is if you take everything and squish them all together, you get this thing, everything. Noun phrase. Marx doesn't like that argument for various reasons, but I do. So that's everything. It is a standard creature in orthodox Merology. Now, if that's everything, what's nothing? Well, it's the flip side. It's what you get when you put no things together, right? Everything is what you get when you put everything together.
Imagine paying like $100,000 to learn this from this guy at university.
When you fuse all things, nothing is what you get when you fuse no things, when you put no things together. And it must be said that nothingness, that the empty fusion is not a standard part of Merology. But one of the things I did in that lecture was show that you could construct a Merology based on very natural ideas, which gives you an empty fusion, a fusion of no things. And you can use that to prove that nothing is both something and nothing, both an object and not an object.
Right.
And if you think about it, I mean, look, there's a paradox concerning nothingness. Well, because nothingness is something. I mean, you can talk about it, you can think about it, you can wonder whether there is such a thing. You are now. So nothingness is something, but nothingness is, well, nothing, no thing. There's nothing there. So this is something I've recently been calling the paradox of nothingness. And it's not a famous paradox like the Zeno's paradoxes or the paradox of self-reference, but I think it's a really interesting paradox. And for me, it ranks right up there with those paradoxes.
Does the sort of paradox that's associated with nothingness characterize everything as well?
No. There isn't a corresponding paradox, because if you think there's everything, it's clearly something. There isn't a corresponding argument that it's no thing. That only arises in the case of nothingness.
Actually, there is. If you have something that refers to everything, it refers to no thing. There. I mean, if you have a universal, like just abstractly, you say, well, everything. You know, and this is supposed to be like the stand-in for everything, because everything, you know, every finite thing is part of the what he calls the everything. What are you referring to? You're not referring to any specific part. You're referring to no thing. The everything is not a thing within the things, among the things. It is itself no thing. I mean, it's basic. I mean, I learned this in my second philosophy class. Not from my teacher, but just doing my independent thinking on my own. I had the big brain moment, you know, that people feel that they have when I realized, holy shit, nothing by definition does not exist. You know, it was Parmenides for about 2 minutes. And then I spent a couple of years just wondering about that on and off about, well, you know, why do we speak about nothing? And then I read Hegel, and then I realized, yeah, the whole thing that I had before was, it's all just language illusions, man. Like, you know, we're just kind of weird animals who for some reason can't not speak about it that way. But no, then Hegel just makes it clear what we're talking about. You know, nothing, no thing. You know, the very absence is present and perfectly intelligible. It's paradoxical to the understanding, but completely rational.
Okay. Is there a paradox of everything of a different sort, then? Outlined by your friend, the co-author, Marcus. In the lecture, it seemed like there was, and then it seemed like you just accepted that as intrinsic,
Yeah,
looping back on itself.
Of course, there are various arguments about everything-ness, okay?
Yes.
And Marcus does use arguments to try to establish that there's no such thing, because it leads you to contradictions. For example, he thinks that everything has got to be part of something different, bigger. So there can't be a totality of everything, because it would have to be part of something bigger, and there's nothing bigger for there to be. That's an argument he uses. I think that's a fallacious argument, because that assumes that nothing can be part of itself, which is a kind of standard Merological principle, but it's one that's been
you mean everything can be part of itself?
He thinks that nothing can be part of itself. Okay. Which is a standard principle of Merology. And I think that principle is, that principle has been questioned by a number of people, and I actually think that principle is incorrect. So he doesn't accept that there's such thing as everything, because he thinks that that's a good argument, and I don't. Whether you want to call it a paradox, I'm not sure.
Okay, now another question is,
so that thing that he said, like nothing or everything being part of themselves, that's like saying that the unit of the apple is part of the apple, which makes perfect sense. I mean, Hegel would be among those people, because that's just how it has to work. That insofar as the unity is clearly distinguished from the parts, it is itself a part among the parts. So that's the reason behind it. I wonder why he denies it. Given this conversation, I can't imagine that it's anything intelligent as to why. So Gabriel is actually right about that. That insofar as the totality of everything would be considered something. In Hegel's logic, to be something is to be something existent, which is related to an other, which would require a higher unity to distinguish these existences from each other. So the totality of everything is necessarily no thing. It is not among the things.
Given you have such disagreements with this colleague of yours, how is it that you could write a book together? What was that like?
Because it was a dialogue. I put my side of the case, he put his side of the case, and then we sort of discussed these things and recorded it and transcribed the recordings and put them in the book. Did we reach consensus? Of course not. This is philosophy.
So it wasn't the sort of book where you write and there's chapters and it's an ordinary book that's not in the form of dialogue.
Correct. It was definitely a dialogue between Marcus and myself.
Okay. Now, what's interesting to me is that nothingness is contradictory. Contradictory seems to be a property of nothingness. But that would imply that nothingness has properties.
Sure.
So that's not a problem for you?
Nope.
That's interesting to me. Because to me, I would think that nothingness would be that which has no properties. Or at least that a property of nothing. I know this is contradictory. Maybe you're allowed to accept this, but a property of nothingness is that it has no properties. Not only does it contain nothing, no thing, but it also has no properties.
Yeah.
But I would like to hear your thoughts on this, please.
Well, look. If you define nothing as the thing which has no properties, then
You notice that cut? I wonder how long he stared up looking to think about it. Maybe he did that for a full minute or something. This is like chapter 1, Science of Logic, page 1. Easy. Like, there you go. Full answer right there.
of course, well, not of course, but you might think that is true by definition. I don't think that's the right definition of nothing.
Which, okay, I mean, I'll expand on it. So, I mean, Hegel begins with the it's not an assumption, but just like the unpropertied nothing, unqualified, indeterminate. It's so indeterminate that it's not even indeterminate. You can't say that it is indeterminate. And what happens is that the meaning of this cannot be had without calling in further details that are inherently happening in the very thinking of this and what it means and what it takes to be able to mean it. That are revealed in layers further down, so that, in order to have being a nothing as indeterminate, the only way this is possible is through a distinction of becoming, the only way this is possible is a distinction of existence, the only way this is possible through distinctions of something and other. And then you can talk about these things as qualified upon the nothingness, but Hegel's whole thing is there is no thing called nothingness, and there is no thing called being. These are not things, things. It's not an ontology of things, really. These are what Hegel calls thought determinations. They're distinctions operative of a single reality, which is making divisions within itself. So it's not that there is this thing called being unfolding or this thing called nothing unfolding. These things are shown to be just immediate senses, immediate concepts of a far more complex thing ongoing, underlying them, for them to even be possible. For the very idea of something abstract, such as being or nothing, to be the case, you need something far more concrete. So what Kurt J. Mongol asked him, if he knew anything about Hegel, which clearly shows that he's not a Hegelian. So for any of you who watch this, quit believing the lie that this guy is anything related to Hegel. he would have immediately answered, well, yes, in the immediacy of the conception of what we mean by nothingness, it has no properties. But given the conditions, the grounds required for this to even be intelligible to us, it must be qualified as something, clearly. So these are not proclamations from the same level, either of logic or ontology. So there is no paradox, really, not on that kind.
Nothing is what you get when you put no things together, which is kind of different. But anything, and that's the quantifier, has some properties. For example, it's self-identical, or it's something, or I'm talking about it, or, lots of things have properties. Everything has properties. And even if you claim that nothing has no properties, well, maybe so, but then that's a property, the property of having no properties. You can't get out of it.
Are there any contemporary philosophers who don't agree with I don't know if it's a law, but self-identity, that X equals...
That's just a stupid position. No properties is a property. Sure, yeah, by Hegelian standards, negations are also realities. So it does work, but it doesn't work just because you make little grammar concerns and state a sentence. That's not why it works. And that's not how... merely predicating things verbally does not make them actually predicates of anything. Predicates only come about by a thing self-predicating itself.
Equals X?
Yes, there are. You can construct systems of logic where that fails. One thing we've learned because of the tools of modern logic, they're so powerful, so versatile, that you can construct a system of logic where anything fails. Let me just sort of say a little bit more about that. There was a revolution in logic around the beginning of the 20th century associated with Frege and Russell and various other people, where they showed for the first time really in the history of logic how you can apply very powerful tools of mathematics to the subject. It was the birth of mathematical logic. And they used the tools to construct classical logic. And for a while it was taken that this had to be the right logic because it was a result of applying the tools. But we now know that these tools are really very powerful. Axiomatics, combinatorics, model theory, proof theory. And you can use these tools to construct so many different non-classical logics. That's not contentious. And they're so powerful that you give me any principle and I can construct a logic where that principle fails. That's how powerful the tools are.
Just basically to say, you tell me anything, and I can just stupidly define it in words against whatever you say. And so long as I keep the symbolic order consistent, I can claim that I'm doing valid logic, even though I'm literally saying retardation.
So just applying the tools is not going to get you in itself anywhere. You've then got to worry about, you've got all these systems of logic. How do you know which one is right to use? And we're back with the question of, applied mathematics. How do you know that it's the right bit of applied mathematics to use for the job? We're in that ballpark. But, so sort of, I sort of digressed a bit, but I thought it was maybe an interesting digression. Yeah, there are logics where the principal identity does not hold.
What are those?
Yeah. So he brings up that issue, like, how do you know what the proper uses, the tools to use are? Well, if it quacks like a duck and it looks like a duck, it's probably a duck. If it looks like a living thing, it's most certainly very useful to go ahead and apply the categories of living things to understand it. If later on you find out, well, actually, no, after investigation, it turns out it's not a living thing. Well, then there you go. A simple solution. You were wrong. But But you take things on their face. It's not a difficult thing. If this looks like a math problem, use some math. If it looks like a language problem, use some language. If it looks like a social problem, do some sociology. It's not hard. Only with extreme abstractions do people start asking these weird things. How do I know what proper things to apply?
Called, and who is a proponent of them, like a serious proponent of them, and not just an intellectually curious endeavor.
Let me see. There are probably a few people, but I'm just reading a paper by a Japanese colleague of mine, Naoya Fujikawa, where he discusses these systems. I heard a talk by a Brazilian logician, Otávio Bueno, who works in Miami, 2 weeks ago, where he was talking about logics about these things. So there are certainly philosophers and logicians who play with these ideas and talk about possible applications. So that's two, right? One's Japanese and works in Japan. One's Brazilian and works in the US. And there are others too, I'm sure.
Speaking of an interesting digression. Actually, it's not a digression. What would you say is the difference between nothingness, so nothingness, but I'm going to call it non-thingness to make it congruent with the following. So what's the difference between non-thingness, non-existence, and non-beingness? Disembroil those for me, if you don't mind.
Okay.
I could have answered that in like 2 seconds. Here's the Hegelian distinction. The non-being is related to the indeterminacy of being. There you go. It's actualized indeterminacy. The nothingness is a relationship to existence. So it's the negation of existence, not the negation of being. And what was the other one I said? Let me just go back a little bit.
Speaking of an interesting digression.
Non-existence.
Actually, it's not a digression. Okay. What would you say?
And the non-existence thing is actually just nothingness. There should be no distinction, categorically speaking.
Is the difference between nothingness, so nothingness, but I'm going to call...
Although if you wanted to actually be like a hard ass about it, you could make the distinction between nothingness, because thingness is something, and so you could still have existence without something. So, for example, a reality or a negation are, as such, not yet something, so they're no thing in that technical sense as well, but they are in existence.
Call it non-thingness to make it congruent with the following. So what's the difference between non-thingness, non-existence, and non-beingness? Disembroil those for me, if you don't mind.
Okay. Look, for a start, the word being is ambiguous. So being is the abstract noun derived from the verb to be in English. And any logician will tell you that's ambiguous. There's the be of predication. John is happy. There's the be of identity. The current president of the United States is Joe Biden. There's the be of quantification. There are people who think that contradictions are true. Now, those are different, okay?
Why are any of those even being? Because I didn't hear the word being in there.
There are. Look, being is the abstract noun derived from the verb to be. And there are, or there is, uses the verb to be. No?
explain this for me. So the sentence, if I was to write it out, I don't see the word to be in it.
No, but
So are you saying it's implicit in?
No, you see the word is, and is the third person singular of the verb to be.
Okay. The reason why I have a sticking point with that is because of you, because you made an interesting, I've never seen this done. You've made an interesting distinction between is and existence.
Yeah, that's a different matter. But I'm just pointing out that the verb is, be, is itself ambiguous.
I see. Okay.
Okay.
For me now, the word is no longer so clear cut. So that's why I didn't make it equivalent to be.
Okay. Now.
Because before I would have made it equivalent to existence. And now since that's
okay.
up in the air, well.
So that's right. Now, one of those meanings, namely the meaning of quantification, has been held by some famous philosophers, including Van Orman Quine, to be equivalent to exists. So he held that when you say there is something, that means there exists something.
Uh-huh.
Now, that's kind of, he made that an orthodox view in Anglo philosophy. It's a very dubious view, and it's were his arguments, because I can say things like, oh, there is something I wanted to get you for your birthday, but I couldn't get it because it doesn't exist. It was an actual picture of Sherlock Holmes. Now, if there is means there exists, what have I just said? I've said there exists something I wanted to buy you for your birthday, but I couldn't buy it because it doesn't exist. I've just contradicted myself. And Dialetheism aside, that's not a very tempting contradiction.
Okay.
So the reason I was pausing is because the question you raised is kind of tricky for several reasons. The first is that the verb to be is ambiguous. The second is that in one of those meanings, some people have identified it with existence, and I don't think that's a good idea. But then there's another part of your question about nothingness and nothingness. Now, that raises different.
If this guy had read Hegel, he'd have a much easier time of explaining that. Even though what he said was not entirely wrong. I mean, in Hegel, at least in German, existence belongs to external being or externalized being. So that's the distinction between, being and existence there, or being is just an immediate qualified. Could be quantitative, could also just be a measurement, which is quantified quality or qualified quantity, whichever way you want to take it. And existence is an essential relationship between an essence being externalized, which is kind of what most people take it to be. Most people mean by existence some kind of external existence, but they mean that as a natural, spatio-temporal, out there existence. In the new translation of the Science of Logic, the Cambridge translation, there's a term in the second chapter, Dasein, which is translated as existence as well, mainly because the term existence etymologically as just standing out fits really well with the sense of general existence, both as an external existence, but also just an existence which is external to another being. So, one being outside another being, regardless of an existence as related to the inner being of my consciousness and the external being of nature. We actually do, in English, talk about existence in both ways of this. So I actually do like Giovanni's translation of Dasein as existence, and he calls the existence in essence concrete existence, which is kind of a mouthful, but what are you going to do? And at least in the notion of the second existence, something that exists out there, concretely exists. Quine isn't the guy who made it up. That conflation between being and existence has been there since forever. You can see it all the way back, as very early medieval philosophy and stuff. Probably even Latin philosophy, Roman philosophy. And it just, it's not until like German idealism where like a clear distinction is finally made between why these would be distinct and like how we can make them distinct. It has nothing to do with grammar. Being is just the indeterminate assertion that, you know, something is being affirmed. Whatever it might be, it could be imaginal, it could be verbal, it could be written, it could be sensuous, it could be intellectual, conceptual. Everything is. So, you know, insofar as you're just merely asserting the immediacy of whatever it is. When you qualify it as existent, you're treating it more concretely. You're specifying it in some kind of relationship to something else. And when you're talking about it concretely existing, then you're specifying particularly as some external being to some other being. Usually really external to some kind of inner being.
Issues again. Okay. So, if I'm right about nothingness, it is no thing. It's something as well, but it's no thing. That's part of the paradox, right? But
you know, if like throwing around creds is important, this motherfucker should give credit to Heidegger. You know, Heidegger's the guy who said, you know, being is no thing. And actually, Heidegger's not the guy who came up with that. A bunch of medievals came up with it before that. It's not unique.
Are there other things which are no thing? That'd be paradoxical, but I mean, is nothingness the only kind of thing like this, or are there other things? Well, there are certainly things that don't exist. I mean, Quine didn't think so, but, you know, Sherlock Holmes doesn't exist. Maybe you believe in some God or other, but, you know, you don't believe in all of them, so whichever ones you don't believe in, that God doesn't exist. And, you know, lots of things don't exist. A touchier question is whether some things are not, and I don't mean by are exist, I mean just a being, right? Not an existent being. And a lot of people think the answer to that is no. The only thing that is no thing is nothingness. That's not actually my view, but a lot of people hold that view. So, okay, I've taken you through some weeds there, and I apologize, but
The weeds are fine. I like the chaparral. We live for the technicality.
the question you asked had the many different, you know, aspects, and it's hard to answer without teasing some of these aspects apart. So, apologies for taking you through these various distinctions.
What came first? Your love for Paraconsistency?
I don't know, but anybody who listens to this, everything he answered, at least regarding the stuff that it wasn't like the intuitive and like classical logic stuff, which I skipped, was pretty basic philosophy 101 shit. Besides like the being nothingness distinction, which is not something you'll learn in 101 classes, but you know, if you take any continental classes, you'll learn pretty quickly about Heidegger. This shit is not shit that's becoming of a guy who is an eminent professor and supposed to be an expert on this stuff. I don't know if he just like really dumbed it down for Kurt, which I wouldn't have, because Kurt's pretty intelligent. He usually grabs onto things pretty quickly. I just think like what he answered was pathetic. If you haven't seen the interview with Chris Langen, Chris Langen makes Graham Priest look like an idiot.
Consistent logic, or your fondness for Buddhism / Taoism?
The former. So you may or may not know that my doctorate's in mathematics, and it was in classical logic. So I was trained as a classical logician. But soon after that, I started to realised there were problems. And everybody knows there are problems, but I thought these problems were serious, right? So that's when I started to work on paraconsistency. At that time, I knew absolutely nothing. Actually, I knew nothing much about philosophy because I was trained in mathematics. But I certainly knew nothing about the Asian philosophical traditions. And I didn't know anything about those until 25 years later, at least 20 years later, by which time I'd been a professional philosopher for 20 years.
If you don't know about his background, look it up. This guy literally got handed a golden parachute for nothing. He was originally trying to sign up for a mathematician's position. There was some screw up with the papers. He actually got hired for a philosophy position. And when he came out, it's like, oh, I don't know anything about philosophy. They're like, yeah, you can take care of it. So, within a couple of months, he just read up on some basic philosophers and started teaching philosophy, and he's been failing up ever since. I mean, god damn, I wish I had that kind of opportunity.
Okay, so Professor, you've traveled to many places in the East, and you've lived there, and you've mentioned your affinity to Taoism and Buddhism, maybe even their practices, I'm unsure, but I'd like to know, how has that point of view influenced your philosophy in the analytic sense?
Okay, well, for a start, I'm not a Buddhist. I don't have any religion, okay? I don't practice meditation. So what I've learned from the Asian philosophical traditions has nothing to do with religion specifically. Of course, I am sympathetic to various views, both ethical and metaphysical, that you find in Eastern traditions, maybe especially Buddhism, but then I'm sympathetic to many views you find in various, Western traditions. Some of them are religious too. So, as I say, this has nothing to do with religion, but that doesn't mean that I disbelieve everything that any of these things says. Okay, so what effect has learning about the Asian traditions had on me? Well, very simply, it's made my understanding of philosophy much richer. So, in all the world's religious traditions, there are some questions which crop up everywhere. What's the nature of reality? How should I live? How do you run the state? How do you know these things? Okay? They all address these in one way or another. Sometimes you find questions in one tradition you don't find in another. That's fine too. Sometimes when they are dealing with the same questions, they will give similar answers. Sometimes they give very different answers. But you want to know these things. You get a much broader, richer canvas of philosophy. So when I do philosophy nowadays, I'm able to draw on a sort of a wealth of ideas from many of the world's philosophical traditions that I wasn't able to do, say, 30 years ago. So my understanding is richer, the tools I have are richer. Hopefully my philosophy is richer.
We haven't talked about why nothingness is the ground of reality.
Yes.
I understand that there's an hour-long lecture, which I'm recommending people watch, where that argument is laid out. However, can you recapitulate that in a succinct form?
Look, it's difficult to do that, but let me at least hint at the reason.
How about just the idea of ontological dependence on nothingness?
Yeah, okay.
I don't know why he says it's difficult. Nagarjuna does it pretty quickly.
Look, let me... Ontological dependence is often couched in terms of certain conditionals, which logicians call counterfactuals. What I mean is this. The shadow of the tree depends for being the shadow of a tree on the tree. If it weren't a tree, it wouldn't be the shadow of a tree. Okay, that's a conditional. It's called a counterfactual. If this thing weren't a tree, it wouldn't be the shadow of a tree. So that dependence is often couched in terms of these counterfactual conditionals. Okay, but counterfactual conditionals, or at least dependence conditionals, can be negative ones as well. So take a hill. If that weren't distinct from the surrounding plane, it wouldn't be a hill. Okay, so there's the counterfactual. If it weren't, that's the counterfactual, distinct from the plane, it wouldn't be a hill. It would be part of the plane, or it would be a ravine. Or no, if it were a ravine, it would still be distinct. Let's just leave it at that. Okay, it's being a hill depends on it being distinct from the plane. Okay, leave it at that. Now, something being an object depends on it being distinct from nothingness. If it were nothingness, it wouldn't be an object, because nothingness isn't an object. So it's a bit like the hill and the plane. What makes it a plane, what makes it a hill, is that it stands out from the plane. And in an analogous way, what makes something an object is that it stands out from nothingness. Okay, that's the basic form of the argument.
That is an even worse argument than I had remembered that he made. That is like one. I thought he was going to go into like, dependent arising or relations like that. No, that is like one of the most moronic ways to frame it. And I mean, that's contradictory in like the worst ways. Well, I mean, he's already admitted that, he's dialectic about nothingness, so he thinks that it's something. But that only works in like a very abstract way. Just saying, well, like the thing is a thing because it's not nothing. That really doesn't actually give you any explanation whatsoever as to why the thing actually is a thing. The immediate appeal is, well, it's not nothing, because if it were nothing, it would not be something. Oh, yeah, that's just pretty true, but it's kind of meaningless.
And I stole that from Heidegger.
Mm-hmm. Now, did he steal it from Spinoza, or is that a different argument?
Not as far as I know.
So the reason I'm saying that is this idea that in order for you to specify an object, you have to write about its negation or speak about what it isn't.
No, that's every determination is a negation. That's Spinoza. I think that's a different thought. I mean, this is a specification, and it does use a negation, but I don't think. But it's a special kind of conditional, which has to do with the nature of something. What Spinoza was talking about was simply a way of, if you want to characterize anything in any way, there's got to be a contrast with something that's not that. Okay, and that's a different point.
There's a professor of philosophy. You may know him. His name is Anand Vaidya.
Yeah, I know him.
There's an interview, for people who don't know, with Anand Vaidya on analytic philosophy, epistemology, Vedism. It's in the description. It's a fascinating gem of an episode.
I listened to that. You can skip it. Nothing interesting that I remember at all.
So there are several insights there into non-dualism, dualism, truth, and falsity. He knows I'm interviewing you, and he said a question. He said, can we understand the Madhyamaka claim that the ultimate truth is that there is no ultimate truth through paraconsistent logic?
Well, the simple answer is yes. Okay. Now, of course, the simple answer is not very interesting because you want to know why. And let me say, first of all, that this is contentious. I mean, even amongst scholars of Madhyamaka, this is contentious. But many years ago, I wrote a paper with an old friend of mine, Jay Garfield, on this question. And prima facie, the ultimate truth is there is no ultimate truth, is contradictory, because it implies that there is something that's ultimately true and there isn't. And Jay and I argued that that's exactly how it should be understood. Now, a lot of Buddhist scholars disagree with this, but at this point we have to go into all the reasons there are for what Buddhists, what the Madhyamaka thought about ultimate truth and its properties and its nature and so on. And that I can't do that.
Yeah, we'll skip the rest of that question. It's actually not that interesting.
Even given that, is there still a contradiction or a paradox that you find to be most challenging? We imagine that we've solved, or that you in your mind are settled on the liar's paradox, but is there another paradox like Newcomb's paradox or something else that sticks in your craw and nettles at you?
Okay, the history of logic is
Notice the cut. I wonder how long he sat there.
full of paradoxes. I guess to the extent that I've thought about any of them, I've found solutions which satisfy me. Sometimes it's a paraconsistent solution, sometimes it's not. I can't think offhand of a paradox that I don't feel comfortable with a certain solution to, but maybe I'm just misremembering.
Well, then can you describe an epiphany moment where you were struggling with something and then an insight came to you? What was that like?
Yeah.
What was it?
Well, here's one. There's another kind of paradox which is very frequently discussed now, wasn't so frequently discussed in the history of logic, called the Sorites paradox.
It's not a paradox at all. I don't know why people call it that. It's literally more of a case of like an indiscernible like concern, like where do you draw the line? You know, when does a pile become a heap? Or when does like, you know, a bunch of individual grains of sand become a heap of sand? All of that is presupposing that a heap of sand is some kind of like actual valid object, and not just some conventional object that's not in itself real. You know, from the Hegelian standpoint, like stuff like a pile of sand is not a real object. It has, you know, insofar as it any objective properties, they're all parasitic on like the actual objects, which are the little crystals and of the minerals that compose the heap of sand. The heap as a heap does not constitute itself at all. You know, it's a contingent object. It's considered an object only in relationship to us who say it's an object. Besides that, it's just an agglomeration of sand particles. Yeah, you can be correct about a heap of sand, but there's nothing true about it as such. You know, what is true in a heap of sand is the crystals themselves. And then insofar as you can like actually have a contingent object, you know, because they are contingent objects, the objectivity of it is not concerned some actually like self-generating thing, which has its own independent like objectivity. It's all contingent objectivity. So you can still have a mass of sand, call it a mound. It could be as large as you want it. It will have objective properties, sure, you know, because any localized body of material, it has certain gravity, a certain capacity of acceleration, momentum, and all these other things you can quantify of the general body itself, even though, you know, the body as such does not constitute itself as anything. It's just a contingent object. So it's not a philosophical question.
So Sorites paradox is when things happen by degrees. So, you know, if I can be totally sober. If I drink 1 cc of alcohol, I'm not drunk. If I drink 2 cc's, I'm not drunk. And generally speaking, if I'm not drunk after n cc's, I'm not drunk after n plus 1 cc's, because 1 cc doesn't make a difference. But of course, if you drink a whole couple of litres of alcohol, I don't know how many drops that is, but it's a lot, right? Then I would be drunk.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So this is called the Sorites paradox.
You notice that like they don't demarcate what they're talking about. You know, he doesn't tell you what the actual measure of being drunk is. He just says, well, you know, somehow I'm going to apply this quality to singular units. It's like the arrow paradox earlier, with Zeno's arrows paradox, where you have a thing that's a discrete within a continuity. But he's pretending that there is no already given measure within that continuity as to what qualifies and what doesn't.
And I did struggle with the Sorites paradox for a long time. I didn't really...
Oh, well, the measure of being drunk has to do with, it's like what people do with sobriety tests. It's your capacity to cognize, your capacity to be like, not impaired in your motor skills. And these things have ranges. It is a continuum. It's not actually a specific thing like, at this drop, now you're drunk. That's completely ridiculous. It's not a paradox at all. It's just a problem of a continuity or a discreteness. And the fact is, like, there is a continuity to this, and at some point we conventionally demarcate at this continuity of some kind of enacted ability. You are considered drunk, and at this other point you're not. Some people, regarding the legal limit, for example, where they measure your blood alcohol level, some people with that blood alcohol are not drunk. Some people are drunk way below that. But, because like you can't really realistically have a test that, that can be that individual, you just need to like conventionally define it in a certain way and go like, at this point, we just legally consider you drunk or not drunk, regardless of whether you fall under like the actual enacted conditions that would count as being drunk. And so, like, as far as I'm concerned, like this is just not a paradox. This is what he called earlier. He called it veridical and falsitical. Well, this is falsitical. It's not a paradox at all. It's only a paradox if you somehow apply drunkenness to the individual units of alcohol. Well, that's stupid. Who does that? Or heapness to the individual crystals of sand. Nobody does that. This is literally a concocted fake problem.
You find a solution that I was satisfied with until, in arguing with or discussing with some friends, they pointed out that there's actually a way of seeing it as a paradox with the same structure of the paradox of self-reference. And once I saw that, then I became sympathetic towards a dialectic solution, because if the paradox of self-reference have a dialectic solution, then so should the Sorites paradox. So that was sort of a moment of epiphany.
Well, you'll have to explain how it's similar in structure.
Yep. Because I also
it's
don't
hard
think
to do
it's
that without a
self-reference.
piece of paper and a chalk or a blackboard. The structure is called the Enclosure schema. That's Inclosure.
Oh, right.
Way back, I suggested that all the paradoxes of self-reference are enclosure paradoxes. They fit this general schema. And it was only when talking to friends we realized that the Sorites paradox fits the enclosure schema that I thought, okay, well, that's the best solution.
So, Professor, many people have been watching maybe for 2 hours now.
I'm sorry they haven't got better.
Well, that doesn't make sense to me. Why would this be an enclosure schema? Let me just go back a little bit.
Because they fit this general schema. And it was only when talking to friends, the enclosure schema. That's Inclosure.
Oh, right.
Way back, I suggested that all the paradox of self-reference or enclosure paradoxes. They fit this general schema. And it was only when talking to friends we realized that the Sorites paradox fits the enclosure schema that I thought, okay, well, that's the best solution.
So, Professor, many people have been watching.
Let me see if I find anything on this. Logical semantic paradoxes, underlying structure, enclosing your schema, principle of uniform solution, sync virtually all systems to paradoxes. Okay, there's papers on this, but I don't know what exactly he's referring to, because I see no reason to think that this is a self-referential paradox at all. One, it's not a paradox. It's just an issue of like fuzzy. You know, at best you could just say like, I don't even know why you would consider this dialectic at all. You would just, if you were going to consider like alternate logics, you would just consider it under fuzzy logic, which is just like, well, there's degrees to which this can be or not be the case, which is exactly what you would use for continuums, because it is a continuum issue. I can see no way in which like this can reasonably be considered a self-reference or self-enclosure. Anyways, that's basically all that's interesting in the interview. Honestly, I think he's a moron. I've already mentioned that I think like all the answers he gave are like pathetically like nearly philosophy 101 answers, which are it's amazing to me. I mean, how could you be considered an eminent thinker and have this level of response? This is the kind of thing that should make people ashamed of academia, quite frankly. I mean, I might as well just plug in. I like the Theories of Everything podcast. I don't listen to like 90%, actually probably 99% really, of what Kurt posts. I just listen to the ones of people who I think are interesting. Otherwise, I just ignore them. But I think Kurt's actually a really good interviewer. A very interested guy. It'd be great if if he would ever like somehow manage to interview a Hegelian, because if this guy blows his mind, God, I mean, someone like Winfield or Holgate would just fucking like be like an atomic bomb blowing it wide open. Way deeper shit than this. Even on the introductory stuff, it's not even like you have to go into like very deep, but I mean, there's just a depth that's even on the surface way deeper than what Priest shows. I would hope that, given my comments, maybe it's kind of obvious to those who watch this channel and those who don't watch this channel, who might just find this because you were looking for something of a Hegelian critiquing Graham Priest or related to Graham Priest. Graham Priest is not Hegelian. Please don't think that he is. He has nothing to do with dialectics. Dialetheism has nothing to do with dialectics. Dialetheism is stupid, quite frankly. Dialectics is not stupid. The examples of dialetheism given is just like, well, something seems true and false. There's no deeper reason besides it appears so to me, and I'm willing to accept it. Why is the liar paradox true and false? Well, seems so to me. I don't see any reason otherwise. No argument as to its semantic concerns. No argument as to whether like it actually makes any sense, and what is being made sense of. Whereas in something like a dialectic, you are given an argument as to what is being meant, why it makes sense that it is contradictory, and why you have no choice but to accept that it is contradictory. There is no comparison between what Graham Priest does and what Hegel does in his logic. There's no comparison between formal logics and, content operational reflex logic like Hegel's.
Does Priest try to present himself or come across as a Hegelian? Or is it just a misconception?
Is it a misconception? It's a misconception.
Because I feel like it's the Eastern philosophy part where they just kind of start associating him with like Hegelian like thought.
I mean, like he's name drops Hegel in some of his essays. That's about it. He's never called himself a Hegelian. But a lot of people who are interested in Hegel for some reason consider him some representative of Hegelian influence. There's nothing of Hegelian influence in what he talks about.
Yeah, even the little that I know of him, I wouldn't categorize him as Hegelian at all. So it's interesting.
Yeah, it's just a weird thing. I think it's people desperate to have some modern current credibility by saying, "Oh, here's a famous guy today who seems to say things like Hegel, even though he says nothing like Hegel." They point to the Dialetheism. They're like, "Oh, that's like Dialectics," and they point to where he mentions, Hegel. Besides that, no relationship. As far as philosophy goes, I think he's a terrible philosopher. As far as like formal logics goes, I mean, he's an expert. I'm not going to deny that. But that's as far as I'm concerned, not philosophy. So that's what I think of that. I also don't think that his stuff related to Buddhism is anything deep either. A lot of people also refer to him as like, oh well, he's kind of indicates some stuff in Buddhist logic. He doesn't. He's just kind of backdrop for him. Occasionally he might name drop it, but that's about it. Unless you're interested in computers or you're kind of some like formal logic head, I don't see why you would ever look into this guy's work. So yeah, for those of you listening, hope you find it entertaining. Honestly, I thought I would have more to say, but there's not much to say regarding what he says. So apologies, it was a bit more boring than you might have wanted. But there you go. Now you know my thoughts on Priest. Make of that what you will. See you around.